Well, at the end of the year 2003, the world celebrated 100 years of flight. But not many people know it, that the first man that ever flew was a man, an Irishman, a man from South Derry, a man from a place called Ballinascreen, a man called Hughie McGuigan, the first man that ever flew. Now, when I was young, I went to school in a wee place called Turkean, where they told me that Da Vinci designed the aeroplane. And my history book said Orville and the brother Wilbur Wright. Their names were on the page as the pioneers of flight. But in last week's Iron Zone, they said that wasn't true. It was a man from South Derry was the first man that ever flew. His name was Hughie McGuigan, and he hailed from Ballinascreen. And to rise up like a bird was Hughie's lifelong dream. For when the other wains were playing on their ropes and on their swings, wee Hughie he'd be praying to God to give him wings. And when the men they went a hunting for the rabbit and the fox, he'd be up the mountain at a place called Eagle's Rock. But when he told them of his plans, the neighbours laughed out loud. They said he was an idiot and his head was in the clouds. And the wife, she was affronted, and she was sitting in the draught, and there was dung around the floor. She was always giving off. For the hens were in the cottage at the fire getting warmed. For Hughie had the 2 half doors, one strapped to every arm. Him heading for the Nicholl, and the rooster roared and screamed as civil aviation was born in Ballinascreen. Now the first flight it was short, for he forgot to flap. He went flying past the curtain, had to buy her Wallace lap. But after a string of curses, he straightened up the back, and he took down the wooden leathers, and he headed for the stack. And like Icarus the Greek, he was destined for the sun, but his legs were getting weak, for the doors he weighed a ton. And the second flight was shorter, and he was like a wounded sparrow, and the sow went running squealing as he collided with a barrow. But when he got off the crutches, all warnings were ignored, and Hughie took his flying dream back to the drawing board. And as the candlelit got shorter, his ideas they got brighter. The weight was in the wood, he needed something lighter. So he bought a pile of geese and ducks and drakes in Dripperstown, and every time they lost a feather, sure it never hit the ground. He was that determined to better his design. The farmyard it was shining, not a stick nor twig nor twine. But the wife was still complaining of her neck and of her head, for Hughie had the pillows stripped off the iron bed, and he was robbing robins' nests and all the feathers he could get, and the hay was lying rotten and the farm went into debt. As he fiddled and he fittered and he hammered and he nailed, in the stable on a table he made himself a tail. He shaped it like a fan. It was light, but it was strong. It was 6 or 7 foot in length, and as broad as it was long. And the country people gathered from Moninina to the Plum, as Hughie took his tail and tied it to his bum. But the neighbours now looked up to him, to the steps beside the barn, as he viewed the Sperrin Mountains from Slievegallion to the Cairn. And he gave the tail a wag as he bended at the knees, then lifting up his wings, he waited for the breeze. And by God, this time he flew. He went floating through the air, fluttering like a butterfly, darting here and there, sweeping like a swallow, and swooping like a swift. But the thorns were coming closer, and he hadn't got the lift. But Hughie was delighted, oh, he was on a high, when they dragged him from the holly bush. Didn't I tell yous I could fly? Now that was years and years ago, but it was never written down. But Hughie, he's our hero here in Dripperstown. And that's why we drink so much, because we're still in celebration of his humble contribution towards modern aviation. So when next you're on a plane and they smile like Mr. Sheen, tell them painted ladies about the man from Ballinasgreen. And tell the pilot too, before he touches down, if it wasn't for Hughie McGuigan, they'd never get off the ground. Thank you. I have to introduce this poem by asking you all a wee question, a wee personal question. Do you ever wake up in the morning with a wee bit of fluff in your belly button? Well, it happens to me all the time, and I thought I'd write a poem about it, but the only thing I could get to rhyme with fluff was a wee village just outside Derry across the border in Donegal called Muff. And the poem is about a wee woman that comes from Letterkenny and to Muff to knit jumpers and sell them out of a wee shop. But she's fond of her wee drink and she doesn't want to buy the wool. So she gathers up fluff from everywhere she can get it, and she threads the fluff and she makes it into wool, and she knits the jumpers and sells them out of the wee shop with disastrous consequences. The poem is called Jumpers Made of Fluff. I thought the boys were codding when they turned me down in Rawdons. They were winking, they were nodding, says I have heard enough. But the fiddles they were bowing and the Guinness it was flowing, says I hear any showing, jumpers made of fluff. Aye, they called her Spinning Jenny. She came from Letterkenny, but a friend she hadn't any when she left that shop in Muff. She could spin and she could knit, and her jumpers they would fit, but sure through them you could spit, for the wool was made of fluff. She'd been gearing it up for years, out of combs and out of shears, and out of her belly and out of her ears. She was an awful woman. If you'd know her for to heap it, she'd tell you for to keep it, and she would call and sweep it, once for a while to see her coming. Now wool it wasn't dear, but Jenny licked her beer, and for years we didn't see her, and the shop was shut and all, and you couldn't look inside, and we thought she must have died, for it's impossible to hide in them parts of Donegal. And in every house about Muff, sure the floors were thick with fluff, and there was bagfuls of the stuff waiting at the door. But Jenny had to stop, for down in that wee shop, she had a bumper crop, she had 1/2 a ton, I'm sure, and that's a lot of fluff. Now the rest of us would bin it, but she seen money in it. Boys, if she could spin it, she turned upon her heel. As the hammer it went down at an auction in the town, she pulled the money around and took home a spinning wheel. She took the fluff and shredded it and twisted it and threaded it and pulled it and pedalled till she had it into wool. She had every shade and colour, but the light was getting duller, for the room was getting fuller and she couldn't find the stool. But soon her fag was flicking and her needles they were clicking, and herself at times was sick, and she had mountains of the stuff. And the floor it was a mess, but she got the one day dressed, and the folks were quite impressed with her jumpers made of fluff. Until it started raining, and from listening to Grada grinning, all the wains they were complaining, and their mammies in a huff. For you couldn't wash nor spin them, wring them, hang them out or win them, for the stuff just wasn't in them, the wool was made of fluff. They were loose and they were thin, and the fluff kept giving in, and they were taking up the bin, and the country had enough. And from Maville to Letterkenny, every Tom, Bill, Dick and Denny was hunting Jumping Jenny in their jumpers made of fluff. They cornered her in Finnegan's, demanding back their tin again, but she was on the gin again, the house got awful rough. And all the diners that were dining, they were whinging, they were whining, there was effing, there was blinding over jumpers made of fluff. They sent for Sergeant Bonner from the old Gardaí O'Connor, and he put the bracelets on her and took her by the cuff. Over Grania's Bray, but sure, what could them boys say? What do you charge her way, knitting jumpers out of fluff? They landed in Buncrana, where a policeman from Ghana and another from Havana was standing in the buff. She'd been dealing in Dubai, Honolulu and Hawaii. They were flying through the sky, the jumpers made of fluff. They held her at the station. She was under obligation. They took out the big Alsatian and they marched him down to Muff. But he wouldn't wag the tail. There was dang all on the reel. She was going to jail for making jumpers out of fluff. In the dock in Letterkenny, up along with Jenny, there was a boy they called Devaney. He was up for stealing ewes. But the judge said if he steered them back to Jenny's and he sheared them, all the charges would be cleared and both the cases would be closed. Well, the shepherd lost his cool, but the judge he overruled, and Jenny got her will. But when she got back to Muff, the door was lying open, the spinning wheel was broken. Now them boys, they weren't joking. In Rawdons or Buncrana, where the boats come in from Ghana, Honolulu and Hawana, oh give us hope, Joanna, there's a crowd of Kuala Lumpurs. And they're living in the sewer of a factory down at Chure, and they're going from door to door collecting fluff for making jumpers. But the doors are getting locked, for the hers are stealing socks, and there's cardigans and frocks, and they're up to all manoeuvres. In the west of Donegal, their backs are to the wall. There's a gang from Senegal, and they're breaking into hoovers and filling it into lorries that they're nicking from the quarries, and McGee's are getting worried for in every catalogue. They're singing in the pubs, or they're swinging with their clubs with fluff up round their gubs. There's fluff in every bog. But up on Tory Island, the fish are sitting smiling, for they've done away with Nicholl, but there's a wild demand for snuff, because they don't keep out the breeze, and all the fishermen are freezing, and they're snottering and they're sneezing in their jumpers made of fluff. And in the hills above Clonmany, every billy goat and nanny is bleating for his mammy, and the sheep are looking rough, for the farmers never shear them, and the rams won't come near them, and the dogs are trying to steer them in jumpers made of fluff to the butchers down in Muff, and that's enough. Thank you.
Ginger John. I think of friends and companions who walked through the days of my life. John Mullen was one. He was a doggy man, a salmon poacher, a provider for his family, friends and his wife. We all knew him as Ginger John. When I was a boy, I went walking. Down along the river I strayed. I noticed a man that was fishing to catch him the fish of the day. He calls out to me, "Son, are you watching? I'll show you the tricks of my trade. For I need you to give me a warning if them bailiffs come to the river," he said. He then says, "Now climb up there to the top of the banking, where you can see along the banks of the land. And if you see there's someone a-coming, start whistling like you're in the ranks of an orange flute band." Well now, he's up to his waist in the water, and with his old cap he's using for shade, he's scanning the bed of the river, as below the on rock a big salmon was laid. Now over the rock he's now lying, he's gazing down on the water below. I've heard my father once saying, "That's Ginger John who poaches that part of the row." There I'm watching the land and the river, as he's moving ever so slow with both arms, them now in the water. He's just getting all ready to go. I'm hearing the flow of the river, and a songbird was singing her song. And not a peep from the man in the water until things they started going wrong. Then I hear him cursing and swearing. There's a splash in the river below, and from the corner from my eye I see coming it's Dougie Simpson, the bailiff of the river Faughan of the Row. Well, I try to whistle a tune for to warn him, but I'm parched in the heat of the sun, so I take off screaming and shouting as off I go on the run. Simpson must think I'm crazy, he must surely think I'm a fool, as I take off running towards him, screaming, "Here comes Jimmy McNichol's big bull!" Well, next thing he's running beside me like a horse just out of the trap, away over the top of the banking, over the shuck, through the field and the gap. He hurdles the hedge like a champion, over and over again, until he reaches his car by the roadside. He says, "I swear to God, I'll not be back at that river, amen." For he continues to praise and to thank me, as he fights to catch back his breath. He tells me, "It happened the last time, as a bullet left me down at the river for death. It put me 2 months in the hospital, and it gored me into the ground." And just before Dougie Simpson did leave me, he slips me £4 or £5. Well, I think of my days and my efforts as I start to make my way home. A few pound it now in my pocket is back at the town I did roam. Wally Johnson, a friend of my father's, did greet me just there at the foot of Main Street, where he gave me a couple of tips just before I stopped off at Miss McNulty's for a bag of her world-famous chips. Well now, I'm up at Higgins the bookies, with money on a dog called I'm Slippy to Win. It bred here in the town of Limavady, and owned by a man in Dungiven called Quinn. Well, to hear the roars, the shouts and the laughter as the dog gets over the line, all the men and the women in the bookies head across to the thatch for some ales, beers and fine wine. Now, just outside my home, I see him walking. I'm soaked from his head to his toe. He smiles and lifts his cap and says, "Thank you, son, for the warning you gave me down along the banks of the row." I come in their kitchen and hear singing. Mammy's down scrubbing her floor on her knees. She tells me Ginger John was in with that big salmon. I could tell by her song she was pleased. He told me a beautiful story of a dog that he once bred won the English Derby, or some sort of other big race. Says I should have known that, just from the smile on his face. Well, that day it started at the river, and just an hour before I got ready for bed, I thought of Ginger John. He was the champion, not the dog that he bred in the shed. Sinead.
I'm going to mention a few things now about teeth, and in particular false teeth. Something that we all have to look forward to somewhere shortly in our lives. But a couple of years ago, I was coming down from Belfast and I stopped in at a restaurant for some food. One of those very posh Scottish restaurants called McDonald's. So I went in, you see, and when I was in, I noticed there was a man and his wife sitting on the table beside me, just across. And he had a big double burger on his plate, and she had nothing. The wee wife had nothing. So I got my meal, and I was watching across, but I was a bit curious that he had the burger and she had nothing to eat. So I got up and I went across and I said, "Excuse me, sir, I hope you don't mind me interfering, but I noticed your wife is not eating anything and you're eating a burger. Do you mind if I buy your wife a burger? It's only a couple of quid." And he looked at me and he says, "No, don't you dare." He says, "Me and the wife have been married for 50 long years." And he says, "We always share everything." So I got the hint, you see, and I sat down. But I was watching it at the side of my eye, I was still curious. He took a couple of bites of the burger, she ate nothing. So it was really annoying me. I said, "I'm going over here again, one last shot." I says, "Excuse me, sir, your wife's eating nothing. I hope you don't mind. Can I buy her a burger?" He says, "No. We are married 50 long years and we always share everything." Well, I says, "With due respect, I noticed she's not eating. What's she waiting for?" He says, "I'll tell you what she's waiting for." He says, "She's waiting for the teeth." So I realized, obviously, he was a very generous man sharing the teeth. And I knew also he was stingy kind of a guy because he only bought the one burger. Because he told me himself then in a conversation afterwards that the following week he went in to the dentist. And he said to the dentist, he said, "Tell me this, Mr. Dentist, how much would you charge me for taking out 2 big wisdom teeth?" The dentist scratched the head. He says, "A lot of work and time and that and local anaesthetic. I need 120 quid. £60 per tooth." Oh, he says, "No," he says, "No, that's too dear. Could you do it cheaper?" Well, the dentist says, "If you come down on a Saturday morning, I'm not busy. There are less people about. I'll do it for £80. That's £40 a tooth." Nah, your man says, no good. He says, "Tell me this," he says, "Mr. Dentist, what could you do for 20 quid? Oh, the dentist says, "Last client I had for £20, he says, I just got them in, I put them down on the floor on the broad of their back, got down up at my knee across their throat, wedged open the mouth, got out a pair of pliers, and I yucked out one tooth and I yucked out the other. I took half the gum with me and there was blood everywhere." Your man looked at the dentist, he says, "Good man yourself," he says, "That's perfect." He says, "I want an appointment next Friday morning at 10 o'clock for the wife." Now, Mick and Johnny were 2 friends of mine at home, out beside where I live in Dungiven, and they always went out for a pint every Saturday night. Religiously, they would go for a pint every single Saturday night. But they're like all of us men, whenever they would be taking a drop of drink, we feel sorry for ourselves. We think the whole world's against us. But it was coming close to closing time, and Mick got up to go to the toilet, and he looked round to his mate, Johnny, and he says, "Johnny, the night," he says, "I feel like a man of 150 years of age." Now, the 2 boys were in their mid-70s. That was a big exaggeration. Johnny looked at him and he says, why do you feel like a man of 150 tonight?" Mick says, well, it's like this here. I'm tired, I'm in constant pain, and I can't even remember what I did last week. To which Johnny said, who's the same age as Mick, Johnny says, that's very odd, Mick. He says, you see the night? He says, I feel like a brand new born baby. Mickey says, how'd you work that out? And Johnny says, it's like this. He says, I have no teeth, I have no hair, and I'm just after wet whistle again. So I suppose sort of lets us know we all have been told for years that you start out as a child and you end up as a child. Now this pair of boys decided a few weeks after that to go to Lough Derg. We've all heard tell of Lough Derg. Now these pair of boys weren't gospel greedy now. They didn't pray at all. They didn't bother with any praying, but they're getting close to their final line. The final day was coming, and they thought, we'll go to Lough Derg. Maybe it'll help us in the next world. So they set sail, you see, on the Friday. So you go down on the Friday, you know the routine, no food, lots of prayers, and then you come home on the Sunday. So the pair of boys went down, and they did the Lough Derg, and on the way home, they were on the way home on the Sunday. And Johnny looked at Mick and he says, I'm not doing no fasting anymore. He says, we've done enough purgatory this weekend. He says, I'm fasting no longer. We're coming on to Balbuffet. He says, pull her in there to the pub. He says, we're going to have a few pints of Guinness. No more fasting. So they pulled the car in. The two boys got out and went into the pub. Mick and Johnny went up to the counter, and there was only one other guy in the bar, just a wee tiny lad sitting down at the corner. Mick went up and says to Johnny, he says, what do you want? Pint of stout. So he ordered 2 pints of stout. And as Mick ordered the pints of stout, Johnny, his mate, went down to the wee man sitting on his own in the corner, and he had him a box for his fist. The wee man fell off the chair. He got off the chair. He had him a kick. He got down. He then hit him with a stool. Down come Mick and he run and says, Johnny, what? Leave the wee man alone. He says, what do you hit that wee man for? Johnny looked at him and he says, that's a Jew. Mick says, what's wrong with that? There's no harm in being a Jew. And Johnny says, but he says, he's one of them boys that crucified our Lord. Which Mick says, what are you panicking about that now for? He says, that's over 2,000 years ago. Johnny looked at him and he says, you might be right. But he says, I only heard about it at the weekend. So I'm finishing off with the last wee story here. It's about a place not that far from here. The Brandywell, many years ago, I'm sure you remember, there used to be greyhound racing in it. And this time there was a greyhound race on it, and the bookie was there taking the bets at the side of the track. And of course he was like all bookies, he was a bit of a gangster. There was only 3 dogs in the race, and one of the race dogs belonged to the bookie. The dog was called the bookie's choice. And of course he had his own dog on it, so what he did was he made his dog the favourite, and what he did was he took his dog out that day, and he filled the dog with spuds and milk so that the poor dog could hardly walk, never mind run. And then get everybody to bet on it, make it the favourite. And he'd make himself a fortune because that dog couldn't run the race. Sure enough, the race was nearly ready to start. Wee Mickey Doherty from down the bog side come down and had a good drop of drink on him. And of course the bookie spied and he said, I'll get a few handy pound of this guy. Mickey, come over, he says. Do you fancy a wee bet today? Mickey says, well. He says, put a few bob, he says, in the bookie's choice. He says, the favourite. Put a tenner on it. He says, I'll tell you what I'll do. He says, I'll put £100 on it. Now this was 30 years ago, so £100 was a lot of money. Bookies thought, great job. So he took the bet, and wee Mickey staggered away. And the bookie was rubbing the hands thinking, I've got a fortune here of poor wee Mickey. Fair enough, the race started. Well, by God, if the bookie's choice was slow, the other 2 dogs, they were slower. And the poor bookie's choice, the dog could have reversed around the track and won the race, and still won it. So they went slowly around the track twice. It took an hour and a half to get the race finished, and then the bookie's choice won the race. Half an hour later, wee Mickey came back to lift his runnings, and the bookie was like a bull. The bookie looked at us and said, Mickey, you're one lucky wee brute. How the hell did you know? He says, that dog that won the race, that's my dog. I filled it with spuds and milk a day, could hardly walk. How did you know to put money on my dog? Wee Mickey looked at me and says, I'll tell you why. You see the other 2 dogs? They belong to me. Cheers.